Power, live from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, talks in the balance. President Trump ramps up pressure on Iran ahead of weekend negotiations, warning Tehran has no cards. Iran setting conditions as Trump signals the U.S. is ready to escalate if talks fail. I'll speak with Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration, this hour. Plus, the economic impact. Rising gasoline prices push U.S. inflation sharply higher in March, the biggest increase in nearly 4 years. A clear sign of how the war with Iran is beginning to hit the U.S. economy. And sounding the alarm, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Fed Chair Jerome Powell convened bank executives for an urgent meeting on the cybersecurity risk posed by the latest AI model from Anthropic. Bloomberg broke the news, and we'll bring you the details. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Joe Matthew has the night off. And we begin with the high-stakes talks between the U.S. and Iran scheduled for tomorrow in Pakistan. President Trump firing off a series of social media posts today, looking to ratchet up pressure on Iran as Vice President J.D. Vance travels to Islamabad to lead the ceasefire negotiations. Vance setting expectations before he took off earlier today.
We're looking forward to the negotiation. I think it's going to be positive. We'll, of course, see, as the President of the United States said, if the Iranians are willing to negotiate in good faith, we're certainly willing to extend the open hand. If they're going to try to play us, then they're going to find that the negotiating team is not that receptive. We're going to try to have a positive negotiation. The President has gave us some pretty clear guidelines.
For more, we turn to Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian, who joins us live from the White House North Lawn. So, Courtney, we heard from Vice President Vance. We thought just a moment ago we might hear from President Trump as he's departing the White House to attend an event in Virginia, and he did not speak to the press. Should we read into that?
I don't think so. I think there's a couple things here. The president doesn't want to get ahead of the talks other than what he previewed on social media earlier. In big moments throughout the 6-week conflict, the president has largely avoided press just before big moments. I was with him just before he launched the attacks on February 28th, and he avoided us that whole day. But the second thing I would point out is the First Lady appeared yesterday, gave a statement, a rare statement about ties to Jeffrey Epstein, denying those ties. And any time that Jeffrey Epstein has been in the news, the president has largely avoided gaggling with reporters.
Okay, so we should consider that precedent, perhaps. That said, to the notion that this is a high-stakes moment and he may not want to necessarily be fielding questions from the press ahead of the talks tomorrow, we know that he has expressed frustration with Iran not opening the Strait of Hormuz, as he understood was going to be promised as part of the ceasefire agreement. Iran now says the negotiations in Pakistan can't begin unless there's a ceasefire in Lebanon and Iranian assets are unfrozen. Is the U.S. going to agree to those things for these talks to happen, Courtney?
I think that's highly unlikely. I think these talks are more focused on finding a way to solidify this ceasefire, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and finding a way to start a path towards peace over the next 2 weeks. Folks I've talked to who are close to the White House and White House officials, have said that this is a pivotal point to really lay the groundwork for peace. But as you mentioned, both sides remain far apart on some of the conditions around this. So I don't think we'll see, a peace deal tomorrow, but I think meaningful progress towards peace.
All right, Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian reporting live from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. And joining me now for more is Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. He, of course, also served as the director of the CIA and was former White House Chief of Staff during the Clinton administration. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Bloomberg. Ahead of these talks with Iran, President Trump, at least on True Social today, said the Iranians don't seem to realize they have no cards other, he says, than a short-term extortion of the world by using international waterways. He's alluding, of course, to the Strait of Hormuz. And with that card that Iran can play, is it Iran, in your mind, that has the stronger hand heading into these negotiations?
Well, there's no question that Iran's control of the Straits of Hormuz gives them a great deal of leverage. I mean, they are literally impacting on our economy. We saw inflation go up dramatically. Americans are paying a lot more at the pump as a result of that. They're impacting on our economy right now. And for that reason, I think the whole issue of the Straits of Hormuz is front and center in terms of whether or not any kind of agreement can be reached that would allow for some kind of international control of those straits in order to allow for free access and free trade to take place. That's going to be a real challenge, and it's front and center.
Well, and to that notion of the challenge, Mr. Secretary, if it's one that may not be easily solved through diplomatic means, do you still see the potential that it's one the U.S. is going to have to choose or not to solve via military means, as the president has warned that our force position is still at the ready in the Middle East should these talks not be successful?
One of the things that's always surprised me is that the administration was surprised by what happened as a result of the attack on Iran. I've been in the Situation Room. We've talked about conflict with Iran. One of the first issues was that they would close the Straits of Hormuz, and we had to develop plans in order to be able to regain control of the Straits of Hormuz. I think the administration had the same kind of choice. It could not simply stand back. This was an issue that truly impacted on the world economy. And for that reason, I was a little surprised that military steps were not taken in order to regain control of the Straits of Hormuz. We're now in negotiations. My hope is that we can work out some kind of approach that allows for ships to travel freely through the Straits of Hormuz again. That is absolutely a bottom line if we're going to be able to achieve any kind of ceasefire that is much more permanent than what we're in now, right now.
Well, of course, the fate of a ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran may not just hinge on what happens, Mr. Secretary, with the Strait of Hormuz, but what happens in Lebanon and whether Israel scales back its strikes against Hezbollah targets there, as Iran says needs to be a precondition for any permanent cessation of hostilities. What is your view on Israel's role in the peace process going forward? They won't have a seat at the table in Islamabad this weekend, but are they potentially the largest impediment to peace at this point?
Well, there's obviously a lot of shaky ground here, and we're not quite sure just exactly how it holds through, whether it's the strikes in Lebanon or whether it's the Straits of Hormuz or whether it's other issues related to missiles flying into Arab countries. The bottom line is that it is absolutely essential that Israel provides some room here so our negotiators can sit down with those from Iran without having these issues be front and center. And I think Israel at least took a step in the right direction by trying to begin negotiations with Lebanon to try to resolve the issues with Hezbollah. If they could continue to have those negotiations, kind of hold back on the strikes while the negotiations are going on in Abbottabad, that would greatly improve the chances for getting somewhere with the negotiations that are critical to trying to end this war.
I wonder, Mr. Secretary, more broadly, as we consider Israel's position and the U.S.'s position for that matter, if we're learning something here across these different fronts about how much you can achieve with an aerial campaign. Obviously, there was much discussion about whether the U.S. was in active pursuit of real regime change in Iran. And many experts came on this show and others to say you cannot do that from the air. That would require a ground operation. Israel tried to eradicate Hamas in part through the air, obviously had to resort to ground operations as well. Now they seem to be wanting to do the same, remove the threat from Hezbollah with these aerial operations. Am I trying to draw too many parallels to this, Mr. Secretary, or have we taken on fights in this manner that we aren't, for both the U.S. and Israel, that we wouldn't have been able to win really in this way?
Well, I think we've understood for a long time that you cannot bomb your way to a change in regime. And that's been the case in Iran. It was the case in Vietnam. We've learned this lesson time and time again. And I think the same lesson is true for Israel. You cannot bomb your way to being able to suddenly change the regime or the enemy that you're confronting. And so it is, I think it's really important at this stage, because frankly, I think all sides are exhausted by this war, that we have got to be able to secure this ceasefire. I think one of the first issues is going to be whether or not the ceasefire is extended, because I don't imagine they're going to be able to resolve a lot in 2 weeks. But at least if you can set the groundwork, talk about some of the key issues. There are a lot of issues here. It's not just the Straits of Hormuz. It's what happens with nuclear enriched fuel. It's what happens with missiles and drones. It's what happens with the sanctions and whether or not a fund is created to help deal with the damages. There are a lot of big issues here. And the hope is that you can begin to make progress on some of these issues so that you can ultimately extend the ceasefire. That's really the goal, I believe, for this first stage.
And finally, Mr. Secretary, as we look forward next week to Congress returning from recess, we're expecting more powers resolutions votes. They're obviously going to have to take up at some point a defense supplemental tied to this war. But I also want to ask you about the FISA renewal. This is set to expire on April 20th. Of course, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a court has just renewed its approval of this law, but it has been contentious, specifically in this House of Representatives. And given the uncertainties we are talking about regarding the Middle East and the threat from Iran, how crucial is it at this moment that FISA is renewed? What kind of position could it put U.S. intelligence services if it is not in the midst of all of this?
I have always believed that it was absolutely critical to be able to extend FISA, mainly because FISA is critical to our ability to be able to determine whether there are terrorists who are trying to attack our country that are located right here in this country. FISA is critical to our ability to deal with terrorists. And so my hope is that the House of Representatives and the Senate act quickly as possible to extend FISA so that we do not undermine our security.
All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time. Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense, we appreciate it. We want to go live now to President Trump, who is speaking to press before boarding Air Force One.
And I think it's going to go pretty quickly, and if it doesn't, we'll be able to finish it off. One way or the other, it's going well. The Navy's gone, the Air Force is gone, all anti-aircraft is gone, the leaders are gone, the whole place is gone. So we'll see how it turns out. So it's J.D., it's Steve, and Jared. You have a good team, and they meet tomorrow. We'll see how it all works out.
You're not going to let them toll the strait, are you? I mean, it's international.
No, we're not going to let that. It's international water. If they're doing that, nobody knows if they're doing that. But if they're doing that, we're not going to let that happen.
What would a good deal look like for you?
No nuclear weapon, number one. You know, I think it's already been regime change, but we never had that as a criteria. No nuclear weapon. That's 99% of it.
Strait of Hormuz as well?
Yeah, but that'll open up automatically. The answer is yes, but the strait will open up. If we just left, the strait's going to, otherwise they make no money. So the strait's going to open. But what we have is no nuclear weapon, but we'll open the strait anyway. Don't forget, we don't use the strait. Other countries use the strait. So we do have other countries coming up, and they'll help out, but we don't use it. It won't be easy. It won't be, I would say this, we will have that open fairly soon.
What's your backup plan?
Excuse?
What's your backup plan if there's no field open?
You don't need a backup plan. We have, the military is defeated. Their military is gone. They have, we've degraded just about everything. They have very few missiles. They have very little manufacturing capability. We've hit them hard. Our military is amazing, the job they've done.
Sorry, sir, is this a one-and-done talk, or are you open to more talks after this, depending on what
I don't know. I can't tell you. I have to see what happens tomorrow. They've been talking for 47 years with other presidents, and we're not doing much talking. Thank you very much. Thank you.
President Trump seen and heard on Bloomberg TV and radio as he now boards Air Force One en route to an event at his winery outside Charlottesville, Virginia, but obviously giving a preview of the talks set to happen in Islamabad tomorrow between the U.S. and Iran. He says, in terms of a deal that might at least have progress toward being reached. He said no nuclear weapon is 99% of what he wants out of the deal. When asked whether the deal needs to include the Strait of Hormuz, he said the strait will open up automatically, and also pushed back on the notion of Iran charging tolls, saying that the U.S. won't let that happen. As far as what happens if these talks are not successful, if there is a backup plan, the president, and I quote, says, "We don't need a backup plan." So there you have it from President Trump. This is the first time, mind you, that we have heard him speak verbally directly to press on camera since the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran were announced. And obviously these comments come at a very high stakes moment as his Vice President J.D. Vance is set to arrive shortly in Pakistan for these talks. So we'll have more on what we just heard from President Trump throughout this hour. But we also, of course, have to acknowledge the impact that the war to this point has had on the economy. As borne out in economic data today, perhaps a contributor to the S&P 500 today snapping a 7-day winning streak to close the day lower, though it did have its biggest weekly gain since November with oil prices following. But it was the influence of oil prices that contributed to the surge in CPI we saw in March. Higher gasoline prices contributing to the biggest month-on-month jump in headline CPI in March in nearly 4 years. So for those details, we turn now to Bloomberg's Matt Boesler, who joins live from World Headquarters in New York. And Matt, it wasn't just the CPI data. It was also UMich consumer confidence data that showed a real concern out there about inflation, those inflation expectations shooting up. How do we know if this is something that will stick even beyond potentially if there is a ceasefire and peace agreement?
Well, everything we're hearing from the people who forecast oil and gas prices say, don't expect these to come down quickly. There's the old adage that goes that gas prices tend to go up like a rocket and come down like a feather. So that's kind of the situation we're in now. You've actually seen the stock market recover to almost back where it was before the war began, but oil prices are still up 50%. So that kind of tells you everything you need to know about the impact that this is having on the economy. And even if we do have this ceasefire that turns into something more durable, the impact that it's going to have on summer vacation plans and spring break vacation plans that are underway right now, and the impact on consumer spending and the broader economy.
Well, so how does this tip the scales, if at all, Matt, around the idea that there are both growth and inflation concerns that could emanate from the conflict, and which one is greater and which one specifically monetary policy is most likely to respond to?
Well, the Fed is certainly on hold right now. Investors are not putting much chance on them doing anything with interest rates this year, really, in either direction. They're going to want to see, what this looks like and how it plays out. They're not feeling any urgency at the moment because the labor market data, especially in the latest jobs report, seem to be holding up. So there's not that urgency to cut rates, and certainly they don't want to be seen as, cutting rates into this inflation shock, right? I think an important thing to understand, though, is this is a lot different from 2022. Last time we saw these increases in energy prices and broader inflation when Russia invaded Ukraine. And the big difference, of course, is that the labor market is in a much weaker position than it was then. We're not seeing the same sort of widespread inflationary impulse that we saw from the reopening of the economy after the pandemic. And so that kind of makes this inflation risk have more of a character of something that is going to eat into household incomes and therefore slow economic growth and maybe add to risk to the labor market, rather than something that necessarily will feed on itself and take off to the upside.
All right, Bloomberg's Matt Boesler in New York. Thank you so much. And as we consider, of course, the economic ramifications of this war, that is something on the mind of lawmakers as they look toward the midterms. And earlier today, I spoke with Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York about that, and also about these negotiations to end the war. Listen.
I don't know that we need to have a vote on a particular agreement. The president does have, under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, 60 days. And so I think after that 60-day period, he certainly should come back to Congress. We should be briefed and updated on what is going on, and we should talk about the next steps together. He is, known as the deal maker. So let's see what comes out of this weekend before we discuss next steps.
Joining me now with her take from the other side of the aisle is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. She serves on the House Appropriations Committee, also is former chair of the DNC. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Clearly, none of us know yet what the outcome of the talks in Islamabad this weekend will be. But even not knowing that, you and your colleagues in the House are planning on a war powers resolution vote in the House next week. What's the purpose of that if we are currently in a ceasefire and on potentially a path toward peace?
Well, thanks for having me. And look, let me just be clear about one thing. The degradation of Iran's ability to be the worst terrorist threat and the most dangerous actor internationally is a good thing. But Trump's approach, his lack of a strategy, goals, objectives. I mean, if we're in a ceasefire, it's news to Lebanon, it's news to Israel. This is more like a game of 52-card pickup, where you throw the cards up in the air and they all land in different places, and we don't really know, what's going on and what direction this is going to take. We have gas prices that are skyrocketing. How is it that the president of the United States had his people negotiate a ceasefire and miss and whiff on something as significant about as far as whether Lebanon was included? He insisted that a condition of the ceasefire was for the Strait of Hormuz to reopen, and it is not reopened. So, I mean, this is not someone who has a clear plan and a strategy. And that is after he threatened to wipe out Iran's civilization, which is an international a violation of international law and would be a war crime. So my goal with the war powers resolution is just to be able to, control the crazy. Congress has the authority to declare war, and we have to be looped in and included on these decisions.
Well, but to your point, Congresswoman, about the question around Lebanon and whether a ceasefire is applicable there as Israel continues to strike Hezbollah targets, are you concerned that the United States' ability to extract itself from this conflict in the Middle East is going to hinge on the decision-making of Benjamin Netanyahu? The fact that you even have to ask that question is part of the problem. First of all, this whole decision, the entire operation in Iran, is on Donald Trump. He owns the massive increase in gas prices. He owns the chaos that has been occurring in the region. He owns the fact that he did not consider that Iran would actually attack our allies. He owns the fact that they would close the Strait of Hormuz. And so, no, this is not about the decisions of the leader of another country. This is about the decisions that our president made and how grossly irresponsible he's conducted these operations. Congressman, you told us previously here at Bloomberg, closer to the beginning of this conflict, that you would be supportive of a defense supplemental in the name of essentially supporting American troops in theater. Given everything that's happened since and the rhetoric we've heard from President Trump that you were just speaking about, do you still feel that way?
Well, what I said was that I would be open to supporting an emergency supplemental because our military are in the region and they are engaged in conflict, and we do need to make sure that we're supportive because our military doesn't have, the option of whether or not they're there. But I also said that we have to make sure that the administration comes to Congress, briefs us fully, and engages in a request for a use of military force. Congress has the sole authority, and right now you have the lowest consumer confidence that was ever measured. That's lower than 2008, lower than COVID. I mean, the president is spiraling this nation downward economically and putting our American lives in danger. And we have got to get a handle on this. And Congress has to grow a spine under the Republican leadership with Mike Johnson.
We just have a minute left, Congresswoman, but Congress also still has yet to fully sort out how, if at all, to fund the Department of Homeland Security. What is your expectation as to what is going to happen next in the House in that regard?
Well, we need to be called back into session right now. The fact that the Republicans have let us be out of session for the last 2 weeks and not agreed on the bipartisan unanimous legislation that came out of the Senate
All right, Congresswoman, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Hope to talk to you once you're back in Washington, back in session. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, thank you so much. And coming up, NASA's record-breaking Artemis II crew is set to splash down to Earth in just a few hours following their historic moon voyage. We'll bring you those details next, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Fed Chair Jerome Powell are sounding the alarm bell over Anthropic's new AI model. The pair summoning Wall Street leaders to an urgent meeting in Washington this week over concerns that the new model will usher in an era of greater cyber risk. And joining me now with the details from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York is our very own Todd Gillespie. So, Todd, we understand now that many of the banks who were present for this meeting are now actually testing out this model, I guess, to suss out what vulnerabilities they may have. How concerned are these lenders at this time about their own risk and the wider risks we're dealing with here?
That's right, Kaylee. Well, what we do know is that this meeting that was convened on Tuesday, under strict confidence with Fed Chair Jerome Powell and Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, occurred when all these bank CEOs were in D.C. And they were urged by these Trump officials to keep using the technology that they are getting, ahead of it's a limited release, essentially. Anthropic has rolled out this new Mythos tool to the banks. But the emphasis really from the Treasury Secretary and the Fed Chair was urging these banks to use this tool internally, to test it, to see its capabilities, and also to detect its vulnerabilities as much as possible. Because what Anthropic has said and what the government has obviously assessed is that this tool is stronger than really any AI tool potentially in terms of its cyber risk that is currently known by the US government. In terms of what the banks themselves are actually detecting right now, it's a bit too early to say. We've really just gotten into a few days so far of these banks using it. We do know previously, publicly, JP Morgan has been named as one of the banks that's used it. We've also just broken the news that Goldman Sachs, Citi, Bank of America, and Morgan Stanley are also among the firms that have been given limited access to this tool and are testing it out actively as we speak right now.
Well, and obviously, as we're considering artificial intelligence and the technology like theirs, there's a massive question as to how it itself should be regulated. But could this, Todd, lead to any regulatory changes in terms of what the banks have to deal with? Capital, for example, that needs to be allocated specifically to addressing cyber attacks or cyber risk. Is it still too early for that conversation as well?
I think it's definitely too early to say definitively whether something like that will happen, but there's no doubt that the people who are caring about those things most, in particular the Fed and agencies like the OCC, which have the biggest supervisory role over US financial institutions, and particularly the most systemically important ones like the banks that met this week, these are the agencies that have people in the offices with these banks day by day, are allowed to basically look across the companies, look at that risk, look at their risk and controls, their data, their backrooms, all of their systems. And these are the people really with the greatest information in the federal government about what these banks can and can't do and what they're exposed to. And these are the same people who called this urgent meeting on Tuesday. So if you put two and two together, I think you can kind of understand that perhaps this is where the conversation is going. I don't think there are any official bank-specific legislative movements yet on this, but the bank regulators are constantly updating their advice, their guidelines for these banks. And we can certainly see, as this space is moving so quickly in the artificial intelligence space, that these banks are being brought on board to collaborate and to give feedback in terms of how the sector, could be monitored and oversight could be continued.
All right, Bloomberg's Todd Gillespie, great reporting, even if frightening. Thank you so much. Now, turning to a story that has captivated the world over the past week and change. In just 2 hours, the crew of Artemis II are set to splash down in the Pacific Ocean after completing the first human mission around the moon in half a century. And joining me now for the details is Bloomberg's Sana Pashankar. So, Sana, obviously they set record going around the dark side of the moon. This is the farthest human beings have ever traveled in space. Now they are coming home. What risks remain for them as they make this final leg of the journey?
Yeah, so reentry is a very critical and, one of the most dangerous parts of the journey. To re-enter the atmosphere, their Orion crew capsule will have to endure very fiery hot temperatures of around 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And it will rely on a specific component called the heat shield to keep the crew and the astronauts safe as they descend back into the Earth's atmosphere. And this is a quick timeline from reentry to when they splash down in the Pacific Ocean. It's a 13 minutes. So it'll all happen very quickly. And yeah, it'll be very exciting to watch.
But of course, Sana, while we're all hoping for a successful end to this mission, the mission itself already has been deemed a success in what they already were able to achieve in this trip around the moon. How does this set the stage for NASA's next steps? I would imagine the work begins anew immediately after they get these guys out of the water.
Yeah, totally. So this was a really important precursor mission for NASA's future plans of landing on the moon in 2028. And they actually have one more mission before that in 2027, which will also, have astronauts on board. So this mission was essentially key because it was the first crewed flight in NASA's Artemis program to return back to the moon. So the crew was really testing those life support systems to make sure everything on board was suited to deliver astronauts safely around the moon and eventually land them in the future. So far we've been seeing really good results, and, it seems like everything more or less has been going well on the Orion capsule. So far, I think we could say this is a success. Obviously, we still need to see reentry. We still need to see them come home safely to fully call it that.
All right, Bloomberg's Sana Pashankar, thank you so much for your reporting. And joining me now for more on this historic mission is Terry Virts, former NASA Space Shuttle pilot, former commander of the International Space Station, also a retired colonel in the U.S. Air Force. Colonel, thank you so much for joining us on what is set to be a historic day after a historic mission. Can we first begin? You know what it's like, obviously, to return to Earth after being aboard the International Space Station. What are they experiencing right now? What are they about to experience?
Well, right now they're floating, and that feels like they're falling. So they've been feeling this for the last 9.5 days, but they know they're about to come back into the atmosphere. So they're in their spacesuits. So they've been in, t-shirts and shorts and pants. It's been comfortable. Now they're back in those bulky spacesuits. They're strapped in. They've got their checklists out. They're going through the procedures to make sure that the capsule is ready to go. Because they know in just a few hours now, when they hit the atmosphere, the gravity builds up slowly, but then it builds up really fast. And after being weightless, I know on my first flight, it was 2 weeks. It felt very heavy and I was very dizzy. So they have a big change that's about to happen. Also, they've been very deep in space, as you pointed out, the farthest that any humans have ever been. And you don't really have a sense of speed, even though they're probably going 20,000 miles an hour right now with respect to Earth. Once they hit the atmosphere, I don't know if the capsule will roll in the right direction, but if it does, they'll be able to look out. And I remember when I came back on a capsule with the Russians on a Soyuz, we were flying over East Africa, and man, the Earth was flying by. Because for all those months, I was really far away. I didn't feel the speed, but it was only just before landing that I felt the speed. I don't know if they'll get to see that or not, but hopefully they do.
Well, and it's incredible to consider, obviously, you yourself has had have this experience they're about to have it. So few people, though, to this point have. And obviously, the aim ultimately of this mission is to make advancement enough that this becomes something that is much more frequent, that we have a permanent base on the moon, that people are constantly shuttling back and forth to. Would you describe this mission as having been a major step forward in the aim of ultimately achieving that? How much faster will things be able to move from here if it's taken us half a century to get back to just this point?
Well, I hope a lot faster. This program was really born under George W. Bush after the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. He had his vision for space exploration. That became Constellation. That got canceled, not canceled. That turned into Artemis. And so there's been a lot of political wrangling, and it's been a mess. And so finally we're flying again. The new NASA administrator had I thought, a great kind of light of fire speech under folks at NASA. We're going to start flying a lot more often, and he's absolutely right about that. So hopefully the NASA's date is next year. I don't know if that'll happen or not, but the next flight will be with the landers in Earth orbit, and then the flight after that will be with a moon lander that will actually go to the moon and land on the moon. We'll see how many years that takes to do. SpaceX and Blue Origin are the two contractors for those landers, but it has taken too long to get here. When I was a little kid seeing the Apollo astronauts, I read about the ancient history of Apollo. That's what made me want to be an astronaut. And here we are later. So I'm excited. This is a great first step. There's going to be a lot more test flights and then finally landing on the moon. And I think we have some momentum. Like Austin Powers said, we have our mojo back.
Well, and mojo is always a good thing, Colonel. When you consider and observe the mission with the lens that you are able to do so with, having expertise and experience that a lot of us don't have, was there anything glaring to you that stood out that might need to be addressed before that next mission next year, before we get to the landers or for our next, crewed launches that we may be considering? Are there, frankly, just any issues in your mind, or of course we have to consider the heat shield as well, and whether we identify any issues there, God forbid not, on reentry?
Yeah. So the one glaring thing for me is that nothing's gone wrong. I mean, they had a minor hiccup with the toilet, but that's a complicated spaceship. The SLS is a complicated rocket. They still need that was the big multi-million-pound rocket that launched them last week. So we still need to review all the data from that. But there hasn't been, a computer failure or a big piece of equipment failure. Everything's been going well so far. So knock on wood, the next few hours, as you mentioned, the heat shield really is the big question. So it had problems on the last flight. They're coming back at a different angle that will hopefully cause less heating problems on this flight. They're going to redesign it a few missions down the road. So let's see how this new trajectory works out. That's the big concern. Also, the parachutes need to come out. So we've tested the Orion many times. The parachutes have always done great. So I expect everything to go well. But you never, as a pilot, we're superstitious creatures. It's not over. We used to say in airplanes, it's not over until the wheels stop. So it's not over until they're on the John Murtha Navy vessel, which is pretty cool to see the Navy, the U.S. Navy grabbing our astronauts, American and Canadian astronauts today. That hasn't happened since Apollo.
Yeah, well, and your point is well taken, Colonel, that this is American and Canadian astronauts here. This is something of an international effort. You, of course, commanded the International Space Station. At a time in which there is so much strife in the world, I think this story particularly has been a much more positive one that we've all clung to over the course of the next 10 days. Is there still the potential for international cooperation in the realm of space, for this to be a story in which countries are much more focused on working together than they may be in other areas, frankly?
Absolutely. And the service module, the big engine on the back of the capsule, is made by the Europeans. And so this is a very international mission. NASA started something called the Artemis Accords a few years ago. Over 60 nations have signed on. So a lot of nations want to help in this Artemis program. That doesn't mean that they're all launching astronauts or there's different levels of cooperation, but they at least agree with the principles of cooperation, peaceful use of space, and so on. So space is an international thing. I've had the privilege of speaking on all 7 continents. Kids everywhere on Earth, in South America, in China, in Europe, they all love space. It's cool. It's a very human thing. So in a world of really bad stories, unfortunately, we're talking about how AI is going to take over the world, and we have this war in Iran that I'd have a lot of comments about. all these bad stories out there, this is a really bright spot. So it's a great day for all of humanity today. Just a few more hours, our international crew will be back on Earth.
All right, that's a great note to leave things on. Colonel, thanks very much for your time. Terry Virts, the former commander of the International Space Station. We appreciate it. And coming up, Hungary getting set for a pivotal election this weekend, just days after Vice President J.D. Vance traveled there to boost an embattled Prime Minister Viktor Orban. We'll bring you the details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. In tonight's Power Brief, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban is set to face a pivotal election this weekend. Orban, the longest-serving prime minister in Europe, is facing a challenge that could end his 16 years in power. Independent opinion polls show the opposition party heading toward a potential landslide victory in Sunday's vote. The election comes just days after U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance attempted to boost Orban's standing by traveling to Hungary to appear alongside him and having President Trump speak directly to ralliers. Calling all gamers, the FAA is looking to recruit video game enthusiasts to be air traffic controllers in an attempt to address the shortage of that critical role. A video released earlier today by the Department of Transportation depicting video game graphics set to techno music encouraged the next generation to use the skills they've developed while gaming to help keep our skies safe. The Trump administration has also announced a slate of new bonuses and other incentives to reward new hires and entice controllers eligible for retirement to stay on longer. And former Vice President Kamala Harris and former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg are the latest Democrats to give hints about their 2028 presidential ambitions, both making appearances at the National Action Network conference in New York this week, along with other potential 2028 hopefuls like Governors Josh Shapiro, J.B. Pritzker, and Wes Moore. The annual political gathering, led by Al Sharpton, has been a key stop for candidates in past election cycles. Governor Andy Beshear and Senator Mark Kelly are expected to speak there tomorrow and may have to answer the same question that Harris did today.
Are you going to run again in 28?
Listen, I might. I'm thinking about it. I know what the job is. And I know what it requires. I also know, one of the things that I've been doing, Rev, is I've been traveling the country the last year. I've been spending a lot of time in the South and many other places. And the one thing I'm really clear about also is the status quo is not working. I'll keep you posted. I'll keep you posted.
So joining us now with reaction to that and more, our political panel, Bloomberg politics contributor and Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, who's a democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, founder and principal of BlueStack Strategies. Ladies, thanks for being here. We do need to get to the ceasefire negotiations between the U.S. and Iran that are set to happen this weekend. But if we could just quickly touch on this, Jeannie, she might run again in 2028. Does that strike you as a good idea?
You heard the cheers from the audience. I don't think we can judge it based completely on that. And I do think a lot of Democrats feel that the loss was not her fault, that she was dealt a bad hand. That said, I think there's also a hunger for somebody new. So it's early. There's a lot of contenders. We see some of them there at the beauty pageant that's going on this week. And, I have to say, Kaylee, it really warms my heart to be thinking about the 2028 election, the invisible primary. So thank you very much. We're on our way.
Of course, we still have a long, long way to go, including getting through the midterm elections this year first. And that's the 2028 consideration on the Democratic side. Maura, obviously on the Republican side, there's been a bit of a live conversation as to whether it is Vice President J.D. Vance or Secretary of State Marco Rubio who may be the one to take the mantle from President Trump. It is Vice President Vance who was tapped to lead the negotiations with Iran in Pakistan this weekend. He should arrive there shortly. Should we read into that in some way?
In terms of 2028, no. I think you should read into it in terms of he has been trying to keep an arm's length distance from Donald Trump and the war in Iran. And so I think him being tapped to do this is Donald Trump's way of saying, no, buddy, you're with me. You're in this with me. And you trying to play this politically for your future isn't going to slide for, with Donald Trump. That's not going to go well with him. And so he's putting JD Vance at the front and center of this negotiation. So I think that's what my take on this is. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my view of it. I don't think that Donald Trump is looking to position JD Vance over Marco Rubio. I think that Donald Trump is still trying to figure out what, his lane and his next 3 years or 2.5 years. He's really focused on himself. I don't think he's thinking about who on the GOP side would come to replace him. He doesn't really like to think of those terms. And for most people in the Republican Party, they're not ready to throw their names out like the Democratic side, where there's no real downside to saying, I'm thinking of running. On the Republican side, there certainly is a downside to saying anything of the sort.
Well, to focus more on the ceasefire negotiations in particular, we did hear from President Trump earlier this hour as he was boarding Air Force One en route to an event in Charlottesville, Virginia, about the negotiations. He contends that the Strait of Hormuz will open up. He says he won't let Iran charge tolls. But when asked whether or not there was a backup plan if talks don't go well, he said, Jeannie, we don't need a backup plan. Could those words come back to bite?
They can. The president does need a backup plan because these are going to be really, really tough negotiations, and they're going to take a long time. I was listening to your great interview with Leon Panetta, and he said, 2 weeks is simply not going to be enough. I mean, you look at how long it took for the U.S. and Iran and the rest of the countries to negotiate the JCPOA. This is the type of negotiation time we're talking about. And so it is going to take time. He's going to need another backup plan. And hopefully it's not what he was talking about to the New York Post today when he was talking about sending troops in again. I mean, we need to have an off ramp on this that helps protect the United States first and foremost and the economy of the world. And I was a little bit surprised to hear the president talking to that gaggle that you played earlier, Kayleigh, about the fact that the Strait of Hormuz, again, he's saying can naturally open on its own. It simply can't naturally open on its own. And so there's going to be work involved to get us there. And that's the hard negotiations that they're walking into tomorrow.
Well, and of course, the Strait of Hormuz, the higher energy prices that have resulted from its closure, all of that could factor into the midterm elections because of higher gasoline prices at home. On the subject of the midterms, we did get some news from President Trump today. He announced that his deputy chief of staff, James Blair, is going to be taking a short leave of absence, according to what the president said on Truth Social, to help lead the charge in the midterms. He says against the radical left, country-destroying Democrats. He says he'll return to the White House after the election. But I wonder what you make of this decision, Maura, to use James Blair in this way, gearing up for November.
I see it more so as the president wanting to have control over the messaging, because I do think that there are many Republicans who are wondering, should they be considering these off-ramp opportunities to kind of steer away from what President Trump is doing and to show their constituents or would-be constituents that they're there to serve them, not to serve the president solely, but to serve the people who they want to represent. And so I think this move is the president trying to consolidate messaging and to keep the party under his, purview and to what he is doing and to be, in line behind him and, to stay true to the course of what the president has been trying to do, what Caroline Leavitt has been touting from the podium during these press briefings. And so I see it as that of a move, quite frankly, but I think it's to be seen what members decide to do or candidates who are running. Do they want to stay in line with the president, or do they want to find those opportunities to separate themselves from what Americans have not been too happy with?
And finally, I want to talk about one message that may be being delivered by President Trump, at least behind closed doors, as reported by the Wall Street Journal this afternoon. Jeannie, apparently he's told people in recent meetings, I'll pardon everyone who has come within 200 feet of the Oval. Now, granted, the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt says the Wall Street Journal, which reported this, should learn to take a joke. However, she said the president's pardon power is absolute. Weigh in on this if you will, Jeannie, but even if this were serious and he were to do so, is he not just following a precedent that was set by his predecessor, Joe Biden?
Yeah, he has an extensive power to do this, to engage in these pardons. But his first day in office, he pardoned over 1,000 people involved in January 6th, many of whom have been now accused of horrible crimes in the aftermath. So this is a president who I think has exceeded anybody's, and certainly the framers on this 250th anniversary, conception of what those pardon powers would be. And I think that's why what the Wall Street Journal is reporting has really struck so many people, because it is such another in a long line of broad expressions of executive authority for something that should be used by the president more like a scalpel than like a hammer.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Maura Gillespie, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much. Of course, for more coverage of all of this, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And tune into Bloomberg this weekend here on Bloomberg TV and radio tomorrow and Sunday, as they'll have full coverage of the talks between the U.S. and Iran slated to begin in Islamabad Saturday morning local time. We'll, of course, pick that story back up on Monday right here on Bloomberg. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power.